Our final speaker, our final keynote speaker of the day, right before the wine reception, is Chris Lorenz. He's an international research fellow at Ruhr University Bochum and an emeritus professor from Free University of Amsterdam. He specializes in theory of history, comparative history, and university policies and politics. In the Netherlands, he's known and feared among students of history for his textbook, The Construction of the Past, which is mandatory reading in almost all history degrees in the Netherlands. And he's currently working on an updated version in English, so everyone can have the pleasure. 2 volumes worth of articles have just been published in Spanish. These volumes are actually for sale on our book stand. And another one was published in Chinese. It's probably best if I don't try to pronounce the title of that one. Other recent publications include the article, If You're So Smart, Why Are You Under Surveillance? Universities, Neoliberalism and the New Public Management, which was published in Critical Inquiry. And the volume, The Contested Nation, which he edited with Stefan Berger. His lecture today is titled, What is in a Period? On the Construction of Time and Space in History. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, for your friendly introduction. I want to thank the organizers also very much for their hard work in this conference and for inviting me. But I want to prevent that the wine will keep waiting too long for us, so I will start immediately with my presentation, which is called What is in a Period on Time, Space and Periodization in History. Ever since history turned into an academic discipline, historians have emphasized that time is essential to historiography. Jules Michelet, mid-19th century, phrased it very shortly. He said, l'histoire, c'est le temps, history, that's time. But I could give many other quotes of historians who were as concrete as that. It seemed that since the problems of chronology had been solved, most historians simply tended to identify the time of history with chronological time. This at least has been the situation until the 1980s, when an increasing number of historians and philosophers of history have started to analyze the notion of historical time as a consequence of 3 developments. I will go shortly into them. The first development was the so-called rise of memory. The rise of memory turned historical time into a problem because it showed that sometimes the past does not go away by itself. Therefore, there may be no substantial distance between past and present, and the dead may keep on hunting the living. The time of memory, and especially of traumatic memory, obviously does not follow the chronological time trail that was and is so fundamental to historians. The second development that provoked reflections on historical time is the rise of post-colonialism and of global history. Both post-colonial theorists and global historians started to deconstruct the time of history as specifically Western time. And we have heard that Sanje Set had more to say about that. And what they did was thus made a connection, a link between the time of history and space. They also started criticizing periodization as Eurocentric, because the distinction between antiquity, the Middle Ages, and modernity implies that Western modernity is the telos, the goal of history. And therefore it's not accidental that most of the reflections on periodization you find recently have been produced by global historians, next to post-colonial theorists, of course. The third and last, The third and last and most recent development that turned historical time into a problem originates in the recent proposal to label the present the Anthropocene. This proposal is based on the argument that the man-made climate change since the Industrial Revolution represents a condition of unprecedented change. This proposal for a new periodization originates in the discussion about global warming, but it has recently traveled to academic history, also among some of the historians present here. What is at stake here, in short, is a proposal to give the contemporary period a new name. Now, what I will try to do in my talk today is to clarify the relationship between history and time a bit further by analyzing some aspects of the ways in which historians are breaking up time in periods. First, I will ask how we can explain the paradoxical fact that although periodization cannot be avoided by historians when they write history, it has hardly been discussed as a fundamental historiographical operation, apart from very few notable exceptions like Michel de Certeau and more recently, Berber Bevanage. Second, I will try to get some conceptual clarification about historical periodization by making a distinction between substantial and chronological periodization. I will argue that the distinction between the present and the past represents the model for all further periodization, and argue that this distinction basically is not chronological but substantial. In the third and last part of my paper, I will illustrate this distinction by analyzing two recent examples. You find this under point 3. Two well-known and very highly praised monographs by Saul Friedlander and Jürgen Osterhammel. Based on the analysis of their books, I will draw the conclusion that as long as historical periodization is identified with chronological periodization, periodization in history will likely remain a theoretical mystery. Now let me start with the question why periodization has led such a paradoxical existence. My diagnosis of the paradoxical status of periodization can be supported by two observations of the German global historian Jürgen Osterhammel. Osterhammel's first observation in case can be found in his widely acclaimed Global History of the 19th Century, The Transformation of the World. It was published in English by Princeton University Press in 2014. And he states in this book, the citation you find there, to the modern European mind, the past appears as a succession of blocks of time. End of quote. In other words, the modern European historian, let's assume that historians are moderns, the past only appears in the form of a succession of periods, or again, phrased a bit more frivolously, no periods, no time. Osterhammel's second observation in case stems from an article in 2004, where he signalizes a clear tendency to avoid the issue of periodization among his fellow historians. Periodisierungsabstinenz is the term in German. So, although modern historians conceive of the past in terms of periods, amazingly few have reflected on what periods are. My last witness is Justus Nipperdey, German historian, happened to be present here, who in 2015 has pointed at the same paradox when he noted that although periodization has provided the institutional skeleton for specializations in history, historians have been relativizing and even criticizing its role ever since. Moreover, Nipperdey points at the remarkable fact that some of the few historians who actually did reflect on periodization have pleaded to get rid of all period labels other than the purely calendrical period labels. Purely chronological labels, like decades and centuries. This line of argument starts with the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, and his and the critical argument of others against non-chronological periodization was and is that non-chronological periods tend to become identified with specific interpretations and values. And you can think of the Dark Middle Ages in this context, or you can think of the Light Enlightenment. Those are examples of the kinds of problems these critics of non-calendrical, non-chronological periodizations had in mind. Therefore, in their mind, non-chronological periodization labels may endanger the progress of the historical discipline and can better be avoided. For those reasons, Huizinga changed the title of his famous bestseller, The Autumn of the Middle Ages, originally published in 1919, into The Waning of the Middle Ages, when it was translated in English 5 years later, so in 1924. In the meantime, he had given in to the critique concerning the substantial implications, the substantial connotations of the autumn metaphor, and had accepted a weaker picture, weaker metaphor. Now, of course, this paradoxical status of periodization in history, its omnipresence combined with pleas to get rid of it, asks for an explanation. And Osterhammel has also suggested one. Osterhammel has basically suggested that the relative lack of reflection on historical periodization may be connected to the long hegemony of national history writing, the long hegemony of national political history as the dominant genre of history writing. Now, national history is a genre of history writing in which the spatial boundaries appear to be obvious because it is dealing with the territories of nation states, like in Hitler's Germany, or in Victorian England, or in Stalin's Russia. The spatial boundaries of periods in, for instance, cultural history are far less obvious because one may legitimately ask to what spaces period labels like the Enlightenment or Romanticism refer. Now, national history writing, according to Osterhammel, is also characterized by temporal boundaries that appear to be obvious, because the periods in political history coincide with obvious or seemingly obvious political and military turning points. Take German history, for example. Every historian working on modern Germany simply assumes that 1871, 1918, 1933, 1945, etc., represent the obvious turning points in the 19th and 20th German century. And he or she uses the corresponding periods in between these turning points in history writing, like the Second German Empire, the Weimar Republic, and the Third Reich. This circumstance helps to explain why many historians in the past have identified periods with chronological data, with chronological dates, I mean, and have refrained from further reflection on it. That sounds like an explanation with some plausibility in my view. If Osterhammel is right, and I think he is, then he also has provided a plausible explanation why especially the critics of national history have problematized periodization in the past. One could think of François Simeon and his critique of the chronological idol of history formulated in 1903, or of Fernand Braudel's arguments for the multi-layeredness of historical times in 1958. At least that was when he wrote this famous article on la longue durée. Obviously, Braudel's arguments for the multi-layeredness of historical times directly translate into arguments for the multi-layeredness of periodizations. But remarkably, Braudel's arguments of 1958 have not led to a visible growing interest of historians in issues of periodization, just as had been the case with the earlier arguments of François Simeon. And interestingly, the relative silence concerning periodization even persists after Reinhard Koselleck, the German historian Reinhard Koselleck, had formulated his widely discussed theory of multiple time layers, his theory of Zeitschichten. Although Koselleck's work has been internationally widely discussed, not in the least in the journal History and Theory, it did not lead to further theoretical interest in periodization. One could even say to the contrary. The Norwegian historian Helge Hjortheim recently tried to close the case of periodization in his widely cited article entitled Against Periodization. And that was published in 2012 in History and Theory. And he argued that Koselleck's theory of time layers represents a fundamental argument against periodization as such. So just like Huizinga, almost a century before him, Hjortheim still wants to get rid from periodization, wants to get away from it. So much for the long-lasting paradoxical status of periodization in history. This leads me to the second part of my talk, in which I will first provide a minimal definition of periods and then go into the distinction between chronological periods and substantial periods, which is crucial in my view. First, let's have a look at the minimal definition of periodization and of a period. Usually, periodization is defined as the division of historical time into coherent blocks that are named periods. Now, the coherence of a period is based either on a substance or on chronology. By a substance, I basically mean a theme or a topic, which may be a war, the rule of a statesman, an economic crisis, a set of ideas, or the rise or fall of anything that, according to historians, may rise or fall. Social classes, elites, average income, etc., etc. Or, that's the other possibility, the coherence of a period may be provided by the duration of a calendrical chronological unit, like a year or a decade or a millennium, a month, etc. Periods exemplify both continuity and change over time and are separated from each other by chronological caesura that demarcate their beginning and their ending. And as far as historians discuss periodization, their discussions usually concern the supposed beginning or ending of a period. The discussions usually refer to supposed borders of periods. Therefore, I can say, or in my view, the drawing of a borderline between the past and the present can be regarded as the model of all epoch-making borders. It's just the fundamental act of border making that is constitutive of periodization. And this is so, in my view, because each period label distinguishes a block of time as a coherent present in relation to the preceding time as the past. The preceding time, in a chronological sense, is labeled as past because it is viewed as different from the present in a substantial sense. So, past making by means of periodization is simultaneously a manner of putting the past at a distance from the present. A distance that does not come automatically in a chronological way, as the time passes by, so to say. Therefore, I think that the use of post-labels like post-war, post-racism, post-communism, or post-boom represents the basic form of periodization, because each post-label creates a new period by declaring the preceding block of time past and closed from a present. My view that the distinction between the present and the past is the model of all periodizations can be supported by Koselleck's famous reconstruction of the period label of the Neuzeit, modern history in English. Koselleck argued that the Neuzeit basically took shape as the post-Middle Ages during the 18th century, when the periodization of European history in modern, medieval, and ancient history became generally accepted. And this periodization became generally accepted because the space of experience was increasingly viewed as substantially new in comparison to the old times before around 1500. Therefore, the substantial characterization of the past before 1500 as medieval was based on a diagnosis of the modern present after 1700 as being new and different in a significant way. And this is my basic point here. The basic point is that the chronological distinction between the medieval and the modern period and the chronological identification of the border between them around 1500 only has followed the substantial distinction between the new and the old times that was made after 1700, and not the other way around. This insight in the primacy of substance over chronology in periodization was explicitly formulated by Karl Marx as the epistemological principle of political economy, when he famously stated that, and then I quote, "The anatomy of the human species provides the key of the anatomy of the apes," end of quote. Although, obviously, their order of appearance in chronological time is exactly the opposite. In history, it would be true to say that the anatomy of the modern period has provided the key to the anatomy of the Middle Ages and of the period of antiquity. This leads me to my third and last point of my paper, in which I will analyze the relationship between the substantial and the chronological periodization in some more detail. And I will take a closer look at the distinction between substantial and chronological periods based on the books, the monographs of Osterhammel and Friedlander I indicated before. As I said before, chronological periods are defined by fixed stretches of calendrical time, like centuries, decades, years, months, etc. Therefore, it's not unusual for historians to divide chronological periods into sub-periods. A history of the 20th century, for instance, may contain chapters dealing with the Roaring 20s, the Swinging 60s, and the Red 70s. But, and this concerns the primacy of substance over chronology I just dealt with, such a history of the 20th century may also not contain any chapter concerning the chronological subperiod at all. And this happens to be the case in Osterhammel's global history of the 19th century, the transformation of the world. And I think this is an important observation concerning the increasing importance of the spatial dimension at the cost of the temporal dimension in the construction of global histories. I'll come back to Osterhammel's book in a minute, but I first want to take a closer look at chronological periodization in history. And here I want to start with the observation that although the structuring of histories in purely chronological periods has surely gone out of fashion, it is far from extinct. Saul Friedlander's award-winning book, The Years of Extermination, Nazi Germany and the Jews, 1939-1945, published in 2007, for example, only contains chapters with chronological titles, each chapter dealing with a period of 6 to 9 months between 1939 and 1945. Friedlander's only chapter without a chronological title is his introduction. Nevertheless, Friedlander's book and his chapters derive their overall coherence from the substance or the theme of the book, which is the Holocaust. Moreover, each chapter has a built-in spatial structure, because Friedlander is telling the story of the Holocaust from the various killing fields in Nazi Europe where the genocide was taking place. Therefore, within his chronological chapters, Friedlander almost literally jumps from one place to another, often from one ghetto to another. And he's following the various local chronologies of the Holocaust. One could therefore say that time in Friedlander's book is predominantly spatialized time. In this sense, on the chapter level of his book, temporality remains subordinated to spatiality as an organizing principle, although the chapter titles are purely chronological. So all in all, Friedlander has presented a substantial history with a highly complex narrative structure interweaving place and time, although on the surface, his history book looks like a solid old-fashioned chronological history. Who would only read the table of contents of this book would really think that this is a traditional, very traditional piece of history, which it is surely not. Deservedly, Friedlander has earned high praise for his narrative skills, for the narrative skills he has exhibited in his masterpiece. A similarly complex and highly sophisticated interweaving of theme, time, and place is characteristic for the organization of Osterhammer's transformation of the world. In contrast to Friedlander's book, Osterhammer's history does not contain one chronologically defined chapter, as I remarked before. This is the consequence of the fact that Osterhammer deliberately made a choice in favor what he calls, in his introduction, in favor of a lateral structure that is primarily based on movement in space. This choice for a lateral structure is simultaneously a choice against a vertical structure that is primarily based on chronological movement in time. Therefore, all of Osterhammer's chapters derive their coherence from a thematic substance and are only named after themes, or what he calls panoramas. Examples of them are standard of living, cities, frontiers, empires and nation states, systems of power and wars, and revolutions. Within each chapter, Osterhammer moves, just like Friedlander does, from one place to another, while following the local chronologies, highlighting analogies, similarities, and differences between the wide variety of cases and regional developments that he is handling in his book. It's a thick brick. The German is almost 1,500 pages, and the English translation, I think 12 or 1,300, so. But it's worthwhile, I can recommend it. He's handling, talking about place, Europe, the Americas, China, India, Africa, they are all dealt with in an exemplary manner. So although the topic of Osterhammer's book is a chronological period, the 19th century, he consciously refrains from introducing any chronological sub-periods. He actually embarks immediately on his lateral trail. And as I said before, my impression is that in global history, this kind of structure of history is becoming far more influential than the vertical structure, the, let's say, chronologically structured books. What makes Osterhammer's history of the 19th century so interesting for philosophers of history, in my view, is the solid self-reflexivity that he has built in his book. His history of the 19th century begins with no less than 3 analytical chapters. The first chapter concerns forms of representations through which the 19th century is known to us in the 21st century, ranging from archives through literature, social sciences to statistics and photography. The second chapter concerns time conceptions of the 19th century, including problems of periodization. In this way, Osterhammer answers the remarkable question, when was the 19th century? The third chapter concerns spatial conceptions of the 19th century and answers the remarkable questions, where was the 19th century? The spatial distinction between center and periphery is crucial here for Osterhammer, because how the 19th century looked did very much depend on where one is looking. A closer look at Osterhammer's answer to the question, when was the 19th century, will lead me to my conclusion on periodization in history. Osterhammer's distinction between the chronological, calendrical 19th century and the substantial, long 19th century is fundamental here. The chronological 19th century simply represents the 100 calendrical years between 1801 and 1900. As a good historian, however, Osterhammer argues that the long 19th century that he locates between 1770 and 1914 is making much more historical sense, because the long 19th century exhibits clear, substantial coherence, much more coherence than the arbitrary chronological 19th century does. The long 19th century has a more or less logical starting point in the American Revolution, the first democratic revolution we know. And the long 19th century has a logical ending in August 1914 with the outbreak of the catastrophic First World and the end of the Old World. Because the coherence of chronological periods is only based on the calendar, Osterhammel typically calls the division of the past in century, and here I quote again, nothing more than a necessary evil, end of quote. Now here, at last, we openly are confronted with the fundamental tension between the chronological and the non-chronological principles of periodization. This tension manifests itself in the substantial arguments that historians like Osterhammel use in the remarkable debates about the meaningful length of centuries and decades. Remarkable because centuries and decades clearly have a specific chronological length by definition. And I could also refer to the other debates about long and short centuries. The 16th century, the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th century are the best known examples. These debates exemplify the fundamental uneasiness of historians with purely chronological and thus with substantially empty periods, with empty beginnings and endings of periods. What is the explanation for this uneasiness? I think the explanation of this fundamental uneasiness is obviously that the very idea of a period presupposes an internal coherence of a period in relationship to other periods, combined with the fact that chronology in itself produces neither coherence nor turning points. Therefore, the turning points of the chronological centuries have not produced any historical discussions of any significance, although they have provoked historians to write books about them and have generated publicity. This holds at least for 1900 and 2000. So, in conclusion, chronology does not and cannot hold the key to periodization in history, and it is about time to get rid of the chronological idol of the historical tribe once and for all. But at the same time, historians and philosophers need to start thinking about the problems that this identification of historical and chronological time seem to have solved for so long. They need to start thinking about the problems that have been covered by this identification. And I think that, for instance, the problem of periodization in general and the distinction of the present and the past in particular have been covered by this identification of historical time and chronological time. In short, there is much work to be done by philosophers of history and reflexive historians to find out how historians are constructing historical time and historical space. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So, I'm gathering questions, I'm looking around, I see Frank is always quick. So yes, Marek, okay. Let's start with these two, Ewa, 3. Let's start with these 3 in this order. There's a microphone very nearby. You have to press twice to...
Yeah, I have a very simple question. I was struck by the fact that when you discussed the book by Osterhammer, you said that it dealt with all of the world, so not only Europe, but also China. And I was wondering what kind of, well, how he deals then with periodization problems. I mean, if you periodize 19th century European history, you will undoubtedly do so and have to do so in a way much different from China. China has its own tempo in history. So if you write a history book about, well, the 19th century, and you want to discuss both Europe and, well, the rest of the world, including China, you are in big trouble. And I think this is a problem not just for the 19th century, but for world history to be different, differentiated from global history. We have very great difficulty, I would say, in periodization of world history, because, well, all the cultures that we have through the centuries have their own tempo in history. So how should we, in your view, deal with this aspect of the problem of periodization?
Marek Tam, indeed. So just a short comment. I think that you could even push further your argument. And I think what is very important is to historicize those calendrical periods. And for instance, the used century and decade as something self-evident or pre-given. But we know that actually, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, in the 18th century, the people were the first time aware that they are living in the 18th century, at least some of them, because before nobody conceptualized time in terms of centuries. And as, if I'm not mistaken, the very concept of decade was invented in the early 20th century only as a tool of periodization. So actually, in a way, those seemingly simple calendrical periods are also kind of substantial periods, and they might not occur in different, I would say, time regimes and different cultures. And therefore, yes, I would argue that even we can say that there is no other period than substantial periods.
I have two short questions. We discussed the problem of periodization in history for a long time. My question is, why you think that we have to come back to this topic right now? And the second question is, you mentioned in the introduction that you are going to talk a little bit about the Anthropocene. And actually, the discourse of Anthropocene is challenging the historical idea of the period because it introduces the idea of geologic time, so a very long time, which is already the problem for scholars, historians like Daniel Lord Smail and his book, The Deep History and the Brain, who is claiming that we should really think rather in a very long term rather than short term. So I come back to my first question, why you think that coming back to the discussion about periodization is so important right now? Do you think that we should really stick to the idea of the period or rather transcend it? Thank you.
Okay, it's my privilege to pick out the questions, which one I will deal with first. I will start with Ewa. Why am I talking about periodization now? Because it seems such old school stuff. Well, I mean, this idea that it's old school stuff, and I mean, your suggestion that my mentioning of the Anthropocene was, cannot be fit in my interest in periodization. I think it's important to discuss or to analyze the issue of periodization because it's a historiographical operation that is taking place all the time. I mean, every historian who writes a history presents us with some kind of periodization, either substantial or chronological or a mix of it. And I think it's time to get some more clarity than we are having. And I am pleading for discussing this out in the open because of the, actually because of disappointment in the discussion around Koselleck. Because I think Koselleck's theory of time layers is interesting in itself because the issue of time is put in front of our attention, but it has certain flaws which I cannot go into now. Achim Landwehr has published widely on it, but the discussion on Koselleck's theory of time layers is going in a direction in which it's going away from the issues I find interesting. And I mean, Jortheim's article against periodization actually triggered me to plea in favor of periodization because this is a widely read and cited article. Well, maybe I should have written a piece in History and Theory instead of boring you with my with my arguments, but nevertheless, that's the background. Another reason for pleading for renewed reflection on periodization is that this whole discussion about the Anthropocene is in fact a discussion about periodization. And I don't know, I mean, this has not been remarked in the articles I have read about it. Outside, usually the introductory remark that this proposal has been formulated in the debate about climate change, and that this is actually a proposal to change periodization in geology. It's meant to replace the Holocene as the last period. And well, few of the authors I've been reading have been taking notice of this fact. Neither has the fact been remarked by any historian I know that in geology this proposal has not been adopted. I mean, geologists, in contrast to historians, have an international commission that decides what the official periodization of geology is, and they did not take this bite to swallow the Anthropocene. So this is, I would say, for anybody interested in promoting this this label of Anthropocene, it would be good to do some more thinking about periodization. As to Frank Ankersmith's question, yeah, what?
Chris, maybe it's inevitable to speak on or discuss about periodization if maybe, as Wallace Stevens said once, we are always at the end. Imagination is always at the end of an era. I remember you talked about this long 19th century. At the end of the 20th century was an interesting discussion. Perry Anderson wrote about that. A discussion between Giovanni Arrighi and Eric Hobsbawm. His 20th century, Hobsbawm, was a very short one, the short 20th century. And Giovanni Arrighi wanted to speak about a long 20th century that began in the seventh decade of the 19th century. I don't know if it's a good periodization or a bad one, but as inevitable as it is, maybe I don't get the point about the substantial. It's a practice, but I am not sure what you're meaning with substantial. it's very important. Maybe it's just a drift of the imagination, but I am sure that you are saying something more than this.
Well, I'm referring to almost all period labels outside the calendrical, chronological ones. They are also identified as thematic or topical periodization. Think of all the, well, the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment, all the Baroque, the age of everything, all labels that go by the age of totalitarianism, of imperialism, etc., are all thematic, substantial labels. What I wanted to plea for is that historians don't hide any longer behind this, let's say, screen of chronology. I have been pointing at this tendency of historians to ignore the substantial problems, also in the whole, in the very distinction between the past and the present. I mean, and Berber has written important publications on this.
This would be a perfect ending, but I've seen there are some more questions.
Actually, when you asked your question, I was addressing the question Frank Ankermit, but I think he disappeared. Is that correct?
So I think Frank is already in the wine. He started.
I share his preference, but I can't. I can't show it.
Let's gather some last questions that have to be very, very short, and then give a very short moment of answer, and then we're going for the wine. I see Fons, and then I see Sanjay.
Mark's question was it? It sounded more like a comment because I'm also of the opinion that in history we only have substantial periodization, but this fact has never been recognized, and that's a starting point where the discussion should start, and not the end point. And well, authors like your time suggest, well, let's not waste our time on it. And if I understood Ewa, well, maybe I'm interpreting your comments too critical.
Okay, so the last two questions.
Yes, I would like to draw a little analogy between your discussion of periodization and the way time is used, and especially how it originated in the natural sciences. So time isn't something that one can assume. You need to introduce a specific measurement procedure. For instance, Galileo used the dropping of a drop of water, and you introduce this procedure because it enables you to empirically verify certain distinctions. It enables you to track empirical distinctions. And I think the way historians should use, and most of the time do use, periodization is also because it enables them to track certain distinctions or in historical evolutions. So periodization is something that should enable historians to empirically verify or track distinctions. I was wondering whether this analogy with the natural science is something you would be inclined to encourage or not.
And then Sanjay? Is there? There's a microphone coming.
Thanks for an interesting paper. Periodization, I think back to the early years of the INTH school, where, you know, one of the arguments was that, you know, periods vary according to practices and institutions. In other words, there isn't a singular time, but rather the time of this and the time of that and so on, which is already an attempt to, in a way, problematize periodization. And later you get Althusser declaring that time is internal to the, carrying on that argument, but declaring that modes of production don't exist in time. They generate their own forms of temporality. So I think in a way it would be fairer to say, not necessarily historians, though historians too, have thought about and dealt with the evident problems of periodization. But what strikes me, and this is where the question, half question bit arises, is how practicing historians, how little affected they remain by all this, in the same way that they remain often unaffected by all sorts of other, you know, unpacking of their assumptions and so on. So I think there actually has been reflections upon and problematizations of periodization, but for the larger part, the historical profession carries on as before, and, you know, every grad student probably reads this, but when he or she is trained into a professional historian, it somehow gets filed away into, you know, a file that says, do not ever open, because it might make writing history difficult.
Chris?
Yeah, you won't get a job.
Okay. I agree, Sanjay, that there has been reflection on periodization, at least this recognition of different temporalities, but not in a radical way. I mean, basically, and this is also something Barbara and also I have pointed out, that in Brauddel's proposal, there's still an ultimate reference to one time, to a container time, and container time is Western time. The same goes for Koselleck. I mean, that is what Achim Landwehr has pointed out in his fundamental critique of Koselleck's theory of times in the Historische Zeitschrift. Also Koselleck, in the last instance, clings on to one timeline which leads to Western modernity. So maybe there is the pleas in the 50s and since for multi-layeredness of time and multi-layeredness of periodizations has not been radical enough. Yeah, that would be my take on it. But the first, let's say, the first issue is, of course, to convince more historians that these are issues which matter. And I think Osterhammel's book is clearly a result of many discussions about periodization and of spatialization of history. I mean, his first 3 chapters are really very rich, and don't support the thesis that the discussions, the theoretical discussions, and the practice of history writing are unconnected. I would not. I think there are exceptions to the rule, which I also see as you have formulated it. Was there another question?
The last.
The enabling character of periodization, I see, or I would plea for a reflexive form of history writing, and the 2 historians I try to analyze, Friedlander and Osterhammer, both are very good examples of self-reflexive historians, including historians who have thought about the issue of periodization, but that's not, that was not where you're hinting. I forgot your question, I must confess. What? Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I hope I did not raise the suspicion that I was here to present you with a new periodization or the solution to all problems of periodization. That was not my claim. I hope that I have succeeded in raising the awareness that here is a serious problem that should be dealt with for both historians and philosophers of history. That was, if I have reached that, you can forget the rest.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot. I'm sure that